The Dreams in the Witch House, a tale of madness, mathematics, and the unknown. This story is presented by Creepy Mystery by H.P. Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He wrote the story in 1932, and it was first published in Weird Tales magazine in July 1933. Lovecraft is famous for his cosmic horror stories, which explore themes of forbidden knowledge, non-Euclidean geometry, and ancient cosmic entities beyond human understanding. The Dreams in the Witch House is one of his classic tales, blending mathematics, witchcraft, and interdimensional horror into a chilling narrative. 1. The Mysterious Lodging. The witch house had stood in Arkham for centuries, its darkened eaves looming over the narrow streets like a silent specter. Few dared to live within its rotting walls, and even fewer lasted long. The house was old, older than the town itself, some whispered, and its very foundations seemed poisoned with the echoes of unspeakable rituals. Walter Gilman, a promising student of mathematics and folklore at Miskatonic University, had always been fascinated by the occult. He had spent long hours poring over the ancient tomes of the Forbidden Library, tracing strange geometric patterns in the margins of books that scholars warned against reading too closely. He was particularly obsessed with non-Euclidean geometry, the idea that space itself could be bent and twisted beyond human understanding. The witch house, with its unnatural angles and whispered legends, was the perfect place to put his theories to the test. The house's most notorious resident had been Keziah Mason, a woman accused of witchcraft during the 17th century Salem trials. Unlike others who burned or hanged, she had vanished, right from her locked cell, leaving behind only a series of symbols scrawled in blood. These symbols, Walter believed, held the key to traveling between dimensions, folding space as easily as one might fold paper. Despite the warnings of his professors and the superstitious fear of Arkham's townsfolk, Walter rented a room in the attic of the witch house. The room was claustrophobic, its walls slanting at impossible angles, making it feel as though it were closing in on him. The floor was uneven, as if the very wood had warped around something unseen. A single window, cracked and coated with grime, looked out over the crooked rooftops of Arkham. At first, Walter dismissed the strange sensations he felt upon entering. The way the light seemed to bend strangely in the corners of the room. The faint hum, like a distant, echoing voice, just beneath his hearing. But soon he began to feel watched. At night, the house creaked and whispered as though something unseen were shifting behind the walls. The very air of the attic felt heavy, oppressive, pressing down on him like unseen hands. Then came the dreams. 2. The arrival of the nightmares. It started as fleeting images, impossible cities of towering spires, a sky not of this world, and the feeling of falling upward into infinity. Each night, the visions grew stronger. Walter found himself drifting through black, endless corridors that seemed to shift around him, pulling him deeper into the unknown. The hum that he had once dismissed as his imagination grew louder, forming itself into whispered voices speaking in an alien tongue. Then he saw her, Keziah Mason. She was ancient, her body wrapped in decayed black robes, her face a mask of withered skin and piercing, inhuman eyes. She would reach for him in his dreams, her fingers like claws, her long nails etched with symbols that seemed to burn into his mind. And she was not alone. Brown Jenkin, the twisted rat-like creature with a horribly human face, always scuttled at her feet, its red eyes gleaming with malice. Sometimes Walter dreamed that it climbed onto his chest, pressing its small, clawed hands against his throat while whispering in his ear in a voice that sounded eerily like his own. At first, he dismissed the nightmares as mere side effects of stress and lack of sleep. But when he awoke, he found deep scratches on his arms and chest, as if something had truly clawed at him during the night. The symbols he had seen in his dreams began appearing on the walls of his attic room, faint at first, but growing bolder each morning. Then, one night, he awoke to find himself standing at his desk, writing symbols he did not understand with a piece of chalk. His hand moved as if guided by something unseen. His research into non-Euclidean geometry had led him to believe that certain angles, certain equations, could create gateways to other dimensions. Now, it seemed something had found him first. 3. The Witch's Mark. Walter Gilman's health had begun to deteriorate at an alarming rate. His once vibrant intellect, which had so captivated his professors at Miskatonic University, was now dulled by exhaustion and plagued by feverish confusion. Dark circles settled beneath his eyes like bruises. His hands trembled with an unsteady pulse, and his skin took on a sallow, waxen hue. He could no longer tell where his dreams ended and reality began. The walls of his attic room seemed alive, the warped angles shifting when he wasn't looking. The wooden beams creaked, not with the settling of an old house, but with purpose, as if something inside them was stirring. But worst of all was the rat, Brown Jenkin. At first, he dismissed it as an ordinary rodent, a mere nuisance in the decrepit house. But this was no ordinary rat. It was unnaturally large, its gray-brown fur slick with an oily sheen. Its tiny, clawed hands left scratches along the wooden floorboards. And its face, it had a face like a human. Not just vaguely human-like, but disturbingly expressive. A mockery of human intelligence, with beady red eyes that gleamed with malevolent cunning. Walter often caught glimpses of it peering at him from the darkness. Sometimes, it would perch on the edge of his bed, its mouth twisting into a grotesque grin, revealing tiny, yellowed teeth. One night, he awoke in a cold sweat to the horrible sensation of tiny feet skittering across his chest. His breath caught in his throat as he felt the rat's clawed fingers press against his skin, its damp fur brushing against his neck. Then a whisper, too close to his ear. "You are marked." Walter sat up with a strangled cry, batting at his chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing except a burning pain beneath his ribs. The mark. At first it looked like a simple scratch, a thin, jagged line drawn across his chest just above his heart. But as the days passed, it darkened, the skin around it turning a sickly purplish black. The pain pulsed beneath his flesh, a dull ache that felt too deep, as though it had been carved into his very soul. When he examined it in the mirror, his breath caught in horror. It was not a random wound. It was a symbol, one he had seen before in the forbidden pages of the Necronomicon. An ancient, blasphemous sigil associated with Keziah Mason, the witch who had vanished centuries ago. A symbol that was said to be a contract, a binding mark placed upon those who would be taken by the otherworldly entities she served. And it was growing. The descent into madness. Walter became obsessed with the mark. He tried scrubbing it away, clawing at it in desperation until blood seeped from his chest. But it always remained, darkening further, as though feeding on his panic. The whispers became stronger. At first, they had come only in his dreams. But now, they followed him through the waking world, soft voices murmuring in a language he did not understand. He began hearing Keziah's voice more clearly, her words dripping into his mind like poison. "The angles are aligning. You see them now, don't you? The door is opening." Walter couldn't sleep anymore. Whenever he tried, he would awaken to find himself in strange places. Not just in his attic room, but outside, in dark alleyways or deep in the university's forbidden archives, standing before open books he had no recollection of touching. One night, he woke to find himself kneeling before a crude altar of bones, his hands stained with something dark and wet. Another night, he found his own handwriting scrawled across the walls in chalk and blood, forming symbols that should not exist. His mind was slipping, and Brown Jenkin was always there, watching. A visit from the past. Desperate for answers, Walter sought out Joe Mazurwick's, an old Arkham resident who had spent years warning people to stay away from the witch house. Mazurwick's, a deeply religious man, had seen the signs before. He looked at Walter with a mix of pity and terror. "You must leave that house," the old man whispered. "The witch marks you. That rat thing? He's her familiar. He has been hers for hundreds of years." Walter's voice was barely a rasp. "Why me?" Mazurwick's expression darkened. "She chooses the ones who understand. The ones who think too much. The ones who see the angles." Walter recoiled, his pulse hammering. He had always believed that mathematics could unlock the secrets of the universe. But what if it had unlocked something far worse? She doesn't just kill, Mazurix warned. She takes. And she takes them far beyond this world. Walter left the old man's house in a daze. But he already knew the truth. He had gone too far. And there was no escaping the mark. That night, Walter tried to fight back. He barricaded his door, scattering salt and protective symbols across the room. He recited every incantation of protection he could remember from his studies. For hours, nothing happened. But just as he began to hope, the air grew thick, the temperature plummeted, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Then, with a sickening crack, the angles of his room shifted. The walls did not collapse, they folded. Walter screamed as the space around him ripped apart, revealing an endless abyss of alien colors and writhing shapes. And standing at the threshold was Keziah Mason. Her rotting lips twisted into a grin as she stepped forward. "It is time, child. The mark is complete." Walter tried to run, but Brown Jenkins scurried onto his chest, his tiny claws digging into flesh. The rat's beady eyes gleamed with triumph. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsating with an unnatural light. And then, the world collapsed inward, and Walter was pulled through the angles, into the abyss. For the ritual and the black void. Walter Gilman did not scream as he was pulled through the angles. There was no time for it. The room shattered around him, the wooden walls splitting apart like fragile paper. The floor beneath him ceased to exist, and in its place, a gaping abyss yawned open. A swirling maelstrom of impossible colors and shifting geometries, where space itself curved and twisted into alien forms. He fell, or perhaps he was pulled, his body contorted by the forces that governed this unnatural dimension. And then stillness. He was somewhere else. The realm beyond understanding. Walter opened his eyes. He stood upon a vast, featureless plain, an expanse of smooth, obsidian-like stone stretching into infinite darkness. Above him, the sky was not a sky but a writhing mass of shadows and crawling lights, flickering in incomprehensible patterns. The air was thick, pressing down on his lungs with an unnatural weight. There was no sun, no stars, only a distant, pulsating glow emanating from something. Then he saw them, the shapes, monolithic structures, impossibly tall, rising from the void like cyclopean pillars of madness. Their surfaces were inscribed with shifting symbols, glowing in sickly hues of violet and green, their angles warping and twisting as if alive. And in the distance something moved. It was vast, its form unknowable. A shifting mass of limbs, eyes, and undulating flesh, coiling and expanding beyond reason. Walter's mind reeled, his thoughts collapsing in upon themselves. This was no dream. This was a place outside of time, outside of reality itself. The ritual begins. A voice called his name. "Walter Gilman, you have come at last." He turned and she was there, Keziah Mason. She stood before him, her ancient, withered form no longer fully human. Her flesh writhed, as if something beneath it was trying to push through. Her eyes burned with unnatural intelligence, and her lips curled in a triumphant sneer. Behind her, Brown Jenkins sat perched on a jagged stone, his tiny fingers clutching at the dark fabric of her robe. His beady eyes gleamed with twisted amusement. "You have seen the angles," Keziah whispered. "You have walked their paths. Now you will serve." Walter tried to move, to run, but his body was no longer his own. His feet carried him forward against his will. His limbs felt like puppets on invisible strings, guided by the unseen forces that lurked in the void. Before him, a massive altar of jagged black stone loomed, carved with blasphemous symbols that seemed to burn into his vision. The surface was slick, coated in a thick, black ichor that pulsed as if alive. Keziah lifted her hands. "The offering is ready." Walter's body convulsed, an unbearable heat surging through his veins. The mark upon his chest burned, searing into his flesh with excruciating pain. And then the chanting began. From the darkness, figures emerged. Tall, robed entities, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. Their bodies shimmered, shifting between solid and ethereal, their voices rising in an unholy chorus. Walter recognized the language they spoke, the black tongue, the words of the outer gods. The symbols on the altar flared to life. The air vibrated with an unseen force, a deep thrumming sound that reverberated through Walter's very bones. And then the gate opened. The presence awakens. A rift tore through the sky, a gaping wound in the fabric of reality itself. From within, a presence stirred. A force so ancient, so vast and incomprehensible, that Walter's mind nearly shattered at its mere awareness. He could not see it, not fully, but he felt it. A great and terrible hunger, a cold intelligence that stretched across eons. And it had noticed him. Walter screamed, thrashing against the unseen force that held him in place. The shadows around him deepened, stretching toward him like living tendrils. Keziah's voice was exultant. He is ready. Take him beyond. The presence descended, an abyssal void reaching for him. The last thing he saw was Brown Jenkins' grinning face, his tiny teeth gleaming in the darkness. And then, he was no longer in the world of men. Final chapter, The Price of Knowledge. You cannot unsee the angles once you have walked them. Walter Gilman no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. The world around him shifted, stretching and warping like a living nightmare. He was neither in the city of Arkham nor in the strange, cosmic void where the ritual had begun. He floated in an abyss of angles, a space outside of time, beyond the understanding of men. The unnatural geometries around him pulsed, shifting in impossible ways. Some angles were doorways, others were traps, leading to places so terrifying that the mere glimpse of them threatened to rip his sanity apart. But something else was here. It was watching him. It was always watching him. The nightmare returns. Walter felt a pull, an invisible force dragging him toward something ancient and malevolent. His vision blurred as the swirling chaos around him solidified into a more familiar shape. The attic room. He was back. Or at least it looked like the attic room of the witch house. But something was different. The walls throbbed, as if they were alive. The wooden floor shifted beneath his feet, warping like liquid. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, a pressure that filled his lungs and crushed his thoughts. And then, Keziah Mason stepped from the shadows. She was no longer the frail old woman from before. Her body was longer, stretched in unnatural ways. Her fingers ended in needle-like claws, and her face had become a grotesque mask, shifting between human and something far older, far worse. She smiled, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. You are no longer a man, Walter Gilman. Her voice was inside his skull, slithering through his mind like a serpent of shadows. You have seen too much, and now, you belong to them. From the darkness, Brown Jenkins scurried forward, his beady eyes gleaming. He laughed, the sound a high-pitched mockery of human speech. Master, master, take him through. Take him through. Walter staggered back, his heart pounding. No, he gasped. I never wanted this. Keziah raised a shaking, clawed hand. It is not about what you want, child. The black ones have already decided. The air rippled, and the room collapsed inward, as if the walls were folding into a single monstrous point. And then they came. The final horror. The walls of reality ripped apart. From the abyss, impossibly long hands reached forward, pale, boneless things with too many joints. Their fingers twisted and cracked as they reached for him. Walter tried to run, but his legs no longer obeyed him. Keziah was chanting again, her voice rising in a terrible, inhuman hymn. And then, the angles shifted. A moment of clarity struck him. The angles were not just doors. They were weapons. In a final act of desperate instinct, Walter threw himself between the shifting spaces, twisting his body at the last second. There was a blinding flash, a scream that was not his own. And then, he was back in the real world. The aftermath. Walter awoke in his bed. His body was soaked in sweat, his muscles aching as if he had been ripped apart and sewn back together. The attic room was silent, the only sound the distant whispering of the wind outside. Had it been a dream? He sat up, his mind still reeling. Then he saw it. A single, inhuman claw mark on the floor. And at the foot of his bed, a tuft of brown fur. Brown Jenkins fur. Walter stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The horrors had been real. He had escaped, but not entirely. He could still feel the angles, still see them at the edge of his vision. And worst of all, he knew they were not done with him. The black ones had marked him. And one day they would return. The whispering angles. This has been another terrifying tale, brought to you by Creepy Misterey. Walter Gilman learned too late that some knowledge is not meant for the minds of men. The angles of reality are not merely shapes. They are doors. And once they have seen you, once you have walked between them, you can never truly leave. Even now, if you listen closely, in the quiet hours of the night, you may hear a sound, a faint whisper, the whisper of the angles. And if you do not turn around, for something may be watching you back. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to Creepy Misterey for more terrifying horror stories. And remember, some doors should never be opened. Not all nightmares are dreams. Some are waiting,